Welcome to the Exploress, time traveling through history one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. We're back, my friends. I can't wait to unveil where we're time traveling in Season 6. But before we dive into our next Ladies' Life series, we're kicking off this year with a fabulous conversation I had with Jenny Williamson, one half of Ancient History Fangirl, about her debut spicy ancient Roman historical, Enemy of My Dreams. Join us as we discuss Jenny's inspiration, how she used stories of the true ancient past to craft her fascinating characters, and hear me gush about this tale of feminine agency, love, and duty, featuring pants-wearing warrior women, boozy banquets, and a party drug sauna. You're welcome. But first, a shout-out to some of our patrons. This is a longer list than usual, as we've been off-air for a little while, so skip ahead a few minutes if you want to get straight to it. My newest pirate queens: Karen, Katie, Anna, Sydney, Melissa, May, Kim, Rebecca, and Catherine. My newest lady presidents: Leslie, Anne, Sarah, and Veronica. My newest boss ladies: Jasmine and Deborah. My newest adventuress: Heather. My warrior queens: MCF, Gail, Christina, Sarah, Amanda, Ika, June, Neve, and Sloan, Kate, Jessie, and Alexis. My imperial empresses: Sally, Letitia, Teresa, Samara, and Faye and Whimsy Soapworks. And my lady pharaohs: Lori, Kimberly, Cheryl, Kot, Laura, Bridget, Sophie, Kate, and the amazing Courtneys. This show is only possible because of the generous donations of all my patrons, and they get lots of bonus goodies for their trouble, including a video bonus episode about Gala Placidia, who Jenny is going to tell us a little bit about. If you want behind-the-scenes sneak peeks, full interviews with guests, and lots of bonus episodes, then just head over to my website, theexploresspodcast.com, and click on Become a Patron. Jenny, hello! Welcome back to the Exploress.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it is always a delight to have you on the show, and it's especially exciting today because your debut novel, Enemy of My Dreams, is coming out. I think when this recording drops, it will be freshly out on shelves, so if you don't have a copy yet, I'm about to convince you to go and get it because I'm obsessed with it. I'm so proud of you, Jenny. This book is so great. I read it so fast and so enthusiastically, and I cannot wait to talk about it. So I know that listeners probably will not have read it yet. So can you pitch Enemy of My Dreams for us?
Yeah. So, in the time of the fall of Rome, which is the early 400s AD, a brutal Gothic warlord teams up with a boozy Roman princess to topple an empire. And I think it's a story of rebellion. It's a story of enemies to lovers. It's a story of scorched earth and found family. And I personally love it. It is so much fun.
It is so much fun. And it's like this incredibly immersive historical, but it's also an extremely spicy romance. So those are like my two favorite things mashed together. So I am most certainly the target audience for this book. And I know that you and I are friends and we've talked about writing a lot. And I know this book took you a really long time to write. It's been with you for a long time. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit about its evolution and its journey to publication.
Oh my gosh. Well, I started it something like 8 years ago.
Oh boy.
It has been a really long time. I'm trying to think. Like when I started it, I had just broken up with a boyfriend. I had some weird health problems. I used to act. I used to try to be like a full-time actress, and I was doing some modeling, and I stopped all of this because I had some chronic health issues that flared up, and I just needed to take a break. And while I was stopping those things, writing just filled the breach, and I just started getting really into this book. I had the idea kind of kicking around in my head for a while, but I finally sat down to write it. At the time, I did not know anything about ancient Rome, really.
Oh, wow.
And I was just kind of making things up. And then I was like, gosh, I should actually research what I'm doing to figure out how to write this book. And thus the podcast was born, Ancient History
Oh.
Fangirl.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Which I started with my co-host, Jen McMenemy, as some people will know, because she was kind of going through a similar process of working on a book that was kind of a romantasy, but based in ancient Greek history. So we kind of started that together. And the first episode that I wrote was called Stuff Alaric Said, which is all about Alaric of the Visigoths and his quotable quotes. And that kind of changed my life from there. So that's how it started.
Wow. Okay, so obviously, as one half of Ancient History Fangirl, we know you're really into history and you know an incredible amount about it, ancient history especially. But this book, and it really shows in this book, I was so impressed by just the level of historical detail and how immersive it is. But this really is a romance at its core as much as it's anything else. It's very spicy, which I loved. So, what made you decide to make it a romance, like romance with a capital R?
I think that all I've ever wanted to write in my life was smut. I just wanted to be a smut writer. That's been my highest calling since I was a kid. Like, since I could read smut, I wanted to write smut. And I think I discovered the first romance in my mom's library when I was like 14. My mom was the town librarian in the very small town in Vermont where I grew up. And she had a lot of romance, and I would just hide in the stacks and read that stuff because I was not supposed to have it. And I was absolutely obsessed with it. And I think I just always wanted to write romance because I love to read romance. And I think before I discovered romance, I read a lot of different genres. I read, mystery. I got into the Stephen King, which was also a thing I had to sneak because I was not supposed to read that. So I was into horror. I was into, anything with horses in it. I was into historical stuff. So like nonfiction about Stonehenge and things, like anything the more ancient, the better I was really into. So I was really an omnivorous reader. And then I discovered romance and I was like, this is my calling.
I remember the first romance I ever read, which was also something stolen from my mother, and it was called it was very popular when I was in middle school for adults, The Horse Whisperer. And I had that's what it was called. Yeah, The Horse Whisperer. Yeah, they made it into a movie later. Anyway, but I was like, "Oh, I love horses. I'm going to read this." And I remember very poignantly being in the back of like my, string practice or something, and I'm reading this book and got to the sex scene and was like, "Oh." Oh,
right?
And like shrinking behind the pages, like everyone would know what I was reading. But yeah, that was I have come very late to romance. I didn't really seriously get into historical romance until I was in my 30s, which is a real shame because it is now one of my favorite things. I know. I feel I was cheated, Jenny. I was really cheated out of the decades I could have had.
Youth.
Yes.
You're robbed of your youth reading romance novels and hiding them from your mom.
Yeah, I would have just had so much fun doing that. But yeah, I have been late to the game, so I'm happy you discovered it early. And I do think that having a romance set in the ancient world, I'm sure there are more of them floating out there on bookshelves, but I personally have not discovered many of them. And I loved it. I love the mixture of the ancient world and romance because I just don't think you see it as much as more contemporary, especially even in historicals. There's a lot of like Regency romance, Victorian romance, but this felt different and fresh to me in a cool way. So what made you decide to set this in the ancient world? Like what made you want to tackle that as your first big romance project?
I think one of the reasons is because I didn't realize how heavy a lift it was going to be,
Yeah, tale as old as time. Yep.
Yeah, I was like, well, I can just do this. And then it turned out to be a whole 8-year odyssey in which I started a podcast with all the research I was doing. So I think that, I had grown up reading a lot of sort of 80s and 90s bodice rippers. I read a lot of Regency. I read a lot of, medieval romances. I read a lot of sort of Highland warrior, dude in a kilt romances, like all of that. I just absolutely devoured. There are very few that I've come across that are set in ancient Rome. So I really like the idea of doing something different. I was also just kind of obsessed with the time period. So one of the things that happened, and I know I've told this story in a lot of different places, so some people may have heard this already, but I had this friend who was a Latin linguist, and she wrote down this quote for me on a napkin and wrote it in Latin and then translated it for me. And the translation was something like, I grind you down with my bare hands, oh, Rome, like, give up your weapons and hide, or something like that. I always screw it up a little bit. This is my, guess at what she originally said. But, that was Alaric of the Visigoths. And I was like, who is that? And she's like, well, it's Alaric of the Visigoths, and he sacked Rome in 410 AD. And I very vaguely knew that someone had sacked Rome in 410 AD, but I did not know anything about it other than that. So I was just immediately hooked. And I was like, who is this person? And what was this time period? And I think I fell in love with Alaric. I think he was easy to love in some respects because we know so little about him. We know a lot in some respects, and in some we don't. So I could really fill him in the way I wanted,
Yeah. Okay.
And also, the time period was so fascinating for me. Just this sort of apocalyptic setting where, the Empire of Rome after 1,000 years is basically crumbling, but the circumstances of the people outside of Rome, because this would have been the migration era where there was a lot of people moving around because there was so much upheaval and the Huns coming in from the northeast and, various other things happening where Rome was basically clashing a lot with its neighbors, and just the change in every direction and the, sort of scorched earth drama of that seemed like a really interesting place to set a story like this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I just kind of became absolutely fascinated with the time period and this person and, everything like that. And just it became my obsession for a really long time.
And it's interesting. So Alaric of the Goths is someone I know very little about. So you say that we don't, we know he sacked Rome. We kind of know that he was, to his enemies, he was certainly rather terrifying, but we actually don't know a lot more about him personally. There are a lot of details that you got to fill in. So let's talk about our heroine a little bit. First of all, Alaric is sexy as hell. I'm just going to throw that out there. He's terrifying. You managed to make him both completely terrifying and so sexy. I could barely stand it. So,
oh, I'm so glad. That is my jam.
Yes, if that is your jam, listener, you need to go out and get Enemy of My Dreams immediately and start reading it. You're welcome. But let's talk about the heroine a little bit, Julia, because, I have not studied ancient Rome nearly as thoroughly as you, but I've studied and talked about it enough on the Exploress that I totally recognized her in many of the stories of the early sort of imperial family of Rome. I saw just shades of these imperial women trying to operate in a system that wasn't really meant for them, but through which they could wield a lot of power if they played their cards right. So let's talk about our just sassy, boozy Julia for a bit. What inspired her, and what were you thinking about when you crafted her character?
So, this is another thing I just absolutely love to talk about, the inspirations for Julia. So there are three women in the ancient Roman sort of, world that I based her on. The first one is Julia the Elder, the daughter of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome.
100%. I saw that parallel so clearly, and I loved it.
Oh my God. Yeah. And I definitely went with my throwaway line with her when I talk about her is that she was, exiled to Pandateria for being too slutty. But, and I mean, that's true. But, depending on how much you believe the ancient sources, are they slandering her? Was she actually plotting against her dad? Did he maybe not want that to be known? So he kind of let it out that she was being too slutty. These are all questions we can have. And so the idea of Julia as kind of plotty, potentially she's got some machinations going behind his back. That was definitely a part of her that I also preserved. But I wanted it to be fun, one of the things that I did when I was thinking about, ways to talk about this book was to think about some of the tropes and themes and things that come up in it. And one of them was never plot a revolution sober. And that's kind of my Julia tagline.
I
So
love it.
she's plotty, but she's also fun, and she could theoretically be exiled to Pandateria for being too slutty or for plotting against her dad, or in this case, her brother. Like that, those would both fit, you know?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
So that was kind of the tack I took with that. Galla Placidia is a second one. She was from the end of the empire, actually from Alaric's time. And she was in Rome when Alaric sacked it. And then she was either probably kidnapped, maybe she just kind of was among the groups of aristocrats wandering out of the city of Rome in the wake of this sacking. It's not really sure, but she wound up with the Goths, and then she wound up marrying Ataulf, who was Alaric's right-hand man.
Mm.
And she was with him for a few years until he got murdered, and then she went back to Rome, where she married this guy Constantius, who she loathed down to her toes. Absolutely hated this man. But then he also died, and she was empress for a while, and just did this fantastic job ruling. Had an absolute iron spine, and was just a really good ruler. So like that part of her too, like she's kind of what I'm seeing my Julia growing into, you know, because there's an arc to this character, like. So she's got that in her as well. And then the third one is like one of my favorite like women to talk about, and she is Honoria, Galla Placidia's daughter, who did not like the person that her mom wanted her to marry, and so she propositioned Attila the Hun to come and rescue her from this terrible marriage. And on the pretext of this proposal, Attila the Hun demanded that he be given half of Rome as like a dowry or something. I'm not sure. And then invaded, and all kinds of, you know, like the vast arc of history that happened after that, and like all of Attila's invasions and his clash with Rome. Like you could trace that back to Honoria propositioning him, and they never met. I think by the time he invaded, she had been, in fact, married off to that guy and then maybe exiled somewhere. Like, we lose track of her in the history after that. But what I love about her and what I find so fascinating is you don't see women, aristocratic women, or, you know, any women that I really know about, like, rebelling against their parents' marriage choices very often, you know? Especially not in such a bold way. So I was always just fascinated with her for that reason, and also the dynamic between her and her mom, because in the sources, I mean, depending on the source you read, and this is definitely disputed, but I really like it because it kind of, for me, reading all of these sources, it was like, gosh, you know, maybe things weren't all uniformly terrible for women all the time. That, you know, one interpretation is that she and Atal fell in love and that this was like a love marriage. So this idea that her mom got to have a love marriage, and why can't Honoria? Why does she have to marry this horrible guy she hates? You know, the fact that her mom was going to make her do it anyway, I think there's a story there. Like there's something behind that I also find interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these women all throughout the empire were used as bargaining chips, and they really didn't have much of a say in who they married. And you could see, I mean, it's easy to say, well, it was a different time. And, you know, they probably had a different way of looking at marriage and agency, and maybe they didn't expect love, and they probably didn't. But it doesn't mean they didn't want it. It doesn't mean they didn't rage against the system that made them sometimes marry, you know, 3 or 4 times, whether they wanted to or not, right? So I loved seeing that there's like a feminine edge here for sure with Julia, right? She's trying to take control of her own fate. She wants agency over the life she carves out. And is there any better trope than, you know, imperial woman from one empire propositions the sexy, scary chief of another, and they end up allied, and maybe they're going to fall in love, or maybe they'll just hate each other, or maybe both.
Right,
Perfection.
exactly. Yeah, and the way that it happens in my book, because I definitely, you know, the propositioning of the potentially frightening barbarian warlord is definitely a thing that happens. Like that's our inciting event here. From Julia's end, it's a story of her trying to seize her own agency. Like she wants to be a player. She does not want to be a pawn. And I love the idea, like she's basically kind of going into this very pragmatically, and she has this idea, which I think is something that happened in ancient Rome, right? Like they kind of thought it was a bit silly to fall in love with your spouse.
Sure.
And that love was kind of this destabilizing madness that you really probably, you know, it's good to have a sort of familial duty and affection for your spouse, but you're not supposed to be passionately in love with your spouse. I mean, that's just ridiculous. So that's kind of the attitude Julia goes into this with, and then she rapidly realizes that she is in love with Alaric, and that is a problem for her. Um, and I love that dynamic too. That's sort of like, I don't trust the idea of love as a concept, and then gradually being won over. Like, that's delicious when I find it in other romance novels, and I was definitely interested in that in this one.
Yeah, and it creates this really great tension in the romance. It's actually quite inconvenient for her to be falling in love with this man on several levels, both sort of, the fact that who he is and what he represents, but also she has been taught and shown throughout her life as an imperial princess to fall in love is a kind of madness. It's a bad idea. Loving your spouse is only going to end in disaster. And she doesn't have a lot of trust for any man, let alone this particular man who has his own agenda. So it is, I mean, their just whole romance arc is filled with juicy tension that I don't want to talk about too much because I'm going to spoil things. But
Right.
it is that dynamic is fascinating, I thought. So, obviously, your deep love of history is just so entrenched and embedded, and it comes across so clearly in this book. Every detail felt carefully considered to me, from the geography, the places you take us, to the weapons, the clothes they're wearing, the food they're eating. I mean, as an avid lover and studier of history, I just saw so much that I've read and come across in there. And I think especially, I read a lot of historical romance, and I have to say that in a lot of these novels, it's not necessarily a fault, it's just a fact, that the history often feels more like set dressing than it does really well-researched history. But this book, the history felt meticulous. It felt like I really could see, okay, Jenny knows what she's doing. She knows this period and it's shining through so clearly. So it's not just setting here, but it's like living, breathing history that the reader gets so immersed in, which I absolutely loved. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the research that you did? Because I know you had to do, like you said, basically 8 years of research for this book. And how clearly did you stick to the history? How did you let it inform the process of writing this fictional story?
Well, I think it was a challenging project, and I don't think I really thought about how challenging it would be when I started it, because I was just like, well, I can just do this. This is fine. This is what people do, But I was basically writing a romance novel about a figure in history where it's like, we don't know much about Alaric. The real Alaric's, he did have a wife at one point. She gets kidnapped by the Romans after this battle, and then we hear nothing else about her, and we know nothing about her except that she's very avaricious and she likes jewelry and she just loves wealth. That's basically it. That's all we know. So when I was writing him and her, like writing him as a romance novel hero and writing a heroine that I basically made up, like there was not a Julia who was the daughter of Theodosius and the sister of Honorius and Arcadius. Like, that did not exist. I made it up. So I'm basically making up a large swath of my plot anyway. And I think that I just absolutely fell in love with the history. But I was also, like, this is something that I refer to as an occasionally true story, where I use the history when I felt like it served the story, but then sometimes I just kind of wandered off on my own and made up my own stuff. There are details in it that absolutely come from all the research I've done. Like, there are some warrior women that came from research I've done on the Scythians. There's the Huns. There's a Hunnic character who's one of the side characters, and there's a weed sauna,
I
which is
loved
one
that
of
so
my
much. I was
the
so
weed
excited when we got to
sauna.
that. The weed sauna was great.
Yes, there's a weed sauna. That's actually something in the Scythian people in the history. That is a thing that has been found archaeologically, and it was very exciting for me. Um, yeah, like thinking about what the saddles would have looked like, what the weapons would have looked like. Like the German warriors used a lot of spears and things like that. But then if I think about Alaric as somebody with a history in the Roman army, he also would have used a sword. So like thinking about what types of weapons everybody was using was really interesting to me.
Mhm.
And like how many, like making educated guesses, I think was important to me too. Like, for example, in my book, Alaric speaks a lot of different languages, and it kind of like the reason for that, like I'm imagining somebody who would have been a tribal leader, like not just of his own people, but many different people. He would have had to communicate on a lot of different levels with a lot of different people. So in my head, he's someone who potentially speaks like 6 languages or something, and maybe a bunch of different dialects of a few of them. So just thinking about stuff like that, like I tried to just add these little touches there. And once I got enough into the research, I feel like it came naturally because I was kind of just mentally living there, you know?
Once you immersed yourself in the world, it's you kind of figure out. I have found that and I've never written straight historical, but I find that you fill in the details and you do the research you need to do as you go. So sometimes you don't know what you need to research or figure out until you get in there. And I loved that Alaric was someone who spoke a bunch of languages. And because he wasn't just, I mean, one can imagine that to have the success he had, he's not just a brutal warrior, but he has to be, to some extent, a diplomat. I mean, he has to be able to inspire different peoples. And so it made total sense to me that he would speak several languages. I loved that.
Yeah, and just thinking about what kingship looked like to the Goths and how he would have maneuvered with his chieftains and things like that, and like managed conflict with them. Um, that's all really interesting to me, and like thinking about what it looks like to be someone who is in a society where they like what Alaric would probably tell you about his kingship is that he was neither a king nor of the Goths, because both of those concepts are like Roman concepts applied to his culture.
Right.
So they did theoretically, according to Roman sources, elect their chieftains or kings. Like Alaric had been elected. So he had to, keep on the good side. Like he ruled with the permission of his people, at least the aristocratic chieftains. I'm not sure if like how much of a populist the original Alaric was. But so he would have been an elected king, or elected ruler, but he also had to be like a warrior and somebody martial. And, part of the kingship involves leading from the front, in battle. So just thinking about the dynamics of that and how that worked was really important, especially in the second part of the book. So like I kind of had to make those two sides of him work together, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure. And Alaric and Julia both just have such complex characters that felt like they did fit in the ancient world, but also were totally accessible to us as a modern audience and specifically what a romance reader would expect. And I think that must be one of the challenges, especially of writing historical romance that's set in such an ancient time, is that you can't be you can't default to the history all the time, right? You're trying to always create this bridge between the modern reader and kind of the modern conception of romance and what we want from a romance story and what feels true and like it could belong in the ancient world. And this is just like the perfect meeting, I think, of the two. Like there's some great feminism here. Like Julia is she's sassy and just such a wonderful character to spend time with. And she feels feminist, but in a way that makes sense for the time and the place, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and that's kind of that's a challenge, like writing characters where it's like I don't know, like I don't necessarily want them to feel feminist or, like their politics or, their attitudes about certain things would fit in the modern world the way that we
Totally.
see it or think about it, because it kind of takes you out of the world and feels a bit anachronistic. But I remember talking about this with a different friend of mine who was a writer ages and ages ago when I was just starting this book and thinking about, feminist themes and how quote unquote feminist to make this book and how I didn't necessarily want it to be, to feel like a modern heroine just kind of plunked into the ancient world. Because like that, the reason I want to write in this time period is partly because I'm interested in the mindset of the people then and like want to kind of sink into that, as much as I can as a modern person myself. And she's like, well, you'll probably, make it feminist because you can't help it. You won't be able to help it, and that's like, we bring ourselves to these books even when we want to excise ourselves from these books, So it was something that I was like, right, I can't just think about it consciously. It'll just happen was sort of how I was seeing it or how I was trying to do it. And then I was like, right, because it took me so long to write it and so long to teach myself how to do this, I was just like, I'm not going to look at that right now. I'm just going to write this book the only way I know how to write it, and then see what I come up with. And if this feels feminist, I'm very glad, because I was hoping I wouldn't be able to help it, but I didn't necessarily want to label it in that direction, like in a modern sense, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly where I think this book lands. I mean, she's someone who we can relate to because she has this rage that she's being pawned off, she's being used by the men in her life, but and she wants to do something about it, and she fights against it and tries to carve her own path, which to me feels very feminist. But she also understands the world in which she's operating, and we see that at every turn, that it's not that she's trying to necessarily remake the system, but she's trying to manipulate the system in a way that reminded me of, like, say, Livia, Augustus's wife, or the Agrippinas, these women who weren't necessarily trying to change the whole system, but were, trying to use it were trying to work it, trying to own it as best they could in the avenues they had. So yeah, I think you did a great job, Jenny.
Thanks. And I think that the three women that I based her on, kind of in their own way, showed me the way to do that, because I think they were all women who also did that in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, obviously there were tons of parallels between this book and things you've covered on Ancient History Fangirl. And I had no idea that the book came first and helped inspire the podcast. So now it's all making sense, Jenny. It's all making sense. One of my favorite parallels was on the pod. You have an episode about Locusta, the poisoner, and Julia in your book talks about poison a couple of times, and it made me think of Locusta. I won't give you details, readers, but early on in the book, Julia tries to poison someone, and it doesn't quite go the way she meant it to. So
Does not go the way she plans. Yeah.
no, not quite. We also see some Scythian warrior, pants-wearing tribal queens, tribal women. Loved that. There are just so many parallels here. So what were some of your favorite historical facts and figures? You already talked about the weed sauna. Were there any other particular historical details that you just were pumping your fist to get to include in the book?
Um, I don't know. Like, definitely the weed sauna was the huge one. The weed sauna, the Scythian warrior women. I think the poison, I was kind of trying to veer away from making Julia like an expert in poisons, because I felt like that would be a little bit obvious. But then I did that episode on Locusta the Poisoner in our podcast, and kind of figured out and figured this out for Julia too, that like as an emperor or someone in the emperor's family, you would have had to have a baseline knowledge of poison. Like, at least that's how I interpreted it. Like you would have, first off, you would have wanted to have a poison kit for if things went south, because things could go south very fast. Like you could be, if you are a close family member of the emperor and the emperor gets assassinated, like things might not go so well for you, and we see this, like Nero had a golden box given him by Locusta of like a poison kit, basically, that he was keeping for himself. And I like kind of imagined that, like in my world in ancient Rome, like, yeah, you might use poison to poison your enemies, but you also might need that as like a weird, like look at Cleopatra, right? Like a weird kind of safety net if things go very, very south. So I kind of imagine this as like Julia has a baseline knowledge of poison because of who she is in the proximity to the imperial family that she has, So, and then she kind of turns that towards a knowledge of healing later in the book, which I found kind of interesting. So that was fun. Trying to think what else. Like I like thinking about horses and people's relationship to horses in this book too. And like I kind of got nerdy about what kind of saddles everybody would have. Like
I
I
loved
don't know how
that.
much of those details actually made it into the book, but there's a lot about how like whether or not the Huns had saddles and like how that changed how they could operate as like basically mobile horse archers, and the kind of saddles like the ancient Roman cavalry had and things like that. These are all little details that I occasionally get really boring and tell people, like that I am very into.
Yeah, but it helped the book to be as immersive as it was. I mean, I certainly, because I am a similar kind of nerd to you, I noticed all of
Hmm.
those little details about the saddles and what kinds of helmets were people wearing and what kinds of, weapons would they have had on hand. I loved that. There's also, again, I'm trying so hard not to spoil. There is a scene in which Julia has knives thrown at her head.
Axes.
Axes, yes, thank you. The axes, you are correct. Even more terrifying. She has axes thrown at her head as kind of it's not a game, it's a test. And I don't want to say anything else because it's so good. And reader, you're just gonna have to discover it for yourself. But
The sexy axe throwing.
I also
Yes.
love that. It was terrifying and amazing. But just all of the details about what kinds of weapons they were using and just all the interesting like cultural, all the different cultures, like you said, there are people from all different cultures in this book coming together in interesting ways. And that
Yeah,
scene
and that was
particularly is just glorious.
yeah, and that was like one of the things that I love about this time period is it would have been like that. Like there would have been a lot of people running around who ostensibly were, had backgrounds in Gothic culture or different cultures who were partially or fully Romanized or had this history like Alaric has, where he had been in the Federati and then he rebelled against Rome, and that scene that you talked about with the axes. So there was this movie um, from like the 50s. Like it's an old oh, what's his name? Kurt something or other, the very obvious movie star whose name I am now blanking on because
Kurt
I am in
Douglas?
my 40s. Kirk
Is that right?
Douglas.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a Kirk Douglas movie. So I don't remember names of actors anymore. This is what happens. um, just warning you. So it's an old Kirk Douglas movie about Vikings, and I watched this movie as a kid, and he there's this scene where there's this Viking woman, and it's one of those sort of like Viking party scenes, um, where everybody's drinking and doing crazy things and are like, like kind of out there things. They have all these like very violent drinking games, and he has to throw axes at the head of this woman who is kind of like in this sort of stockade situation to prove to everybody that they had not committed adultery together
Okay.
or they had not or she had not committed adultery, I think it was, and like it
Oh.
was like a sort of godly test to see if the gods protected her and she did not get axed,
Right, right.
then she was
Yes.
innocent of these accusations. And this guy that Kirk Douglas is playing, as I remember it, and I might be misremembering this because it has been so long since I actually watched this scene, he throws the axes, and I remember as a child, like, or maybe I was like 14. I don't remember where this falls in my romance reading journey, but I
Mm.
just knew that those two people were committing adultery together. And I was like, this is so romantic. So I wanted to have some kind of a, sexy axe throwing situation.
Yep. And
And
you,
mine is very
yeah.
different. Like it's not the same thing, but like there is some sexy axe throwing.
And it is sexy axe throwing. That's the only way to describe it. And it is
Yes.
fantastic. And we just don't want to spoil it. So we're not going to say anything else. You're just going to have to
No,
discover it on your own. Okay,
indeed.
and while we're talking about some parallels between Ancient History Fangirl and the book, are there any specific episodes of your show that readers might like to listen to before they dive in, or even after they read Enemy of My Dreams?
Yeah, so there's we did a 3-episode series on Alaric of the Visigoths and then Galla Placidia and Atalf and then Honoria and Attila the Hun that I think gives you a good background in this time period, and you can kind of see where I didn't depart from the actual history. Um so that'll give you a really good overview. You can also listen to our Amazon's episode part 2 about Scythian warrior women. I'm trying to think what else. We are, as I'm not sure when this is going to drop, but I think at some point soon, either soon after this drops or shortly before, I'm not sure, we are going to start a series about the Goths that's going to delve more into the history of this time period and the migration era and the Goths' relationship with the Romans. So hopefully we will be informing you about that even more. Get excited.
Yeah. Cool. And I mean, to be clear, listeners, you do not need to know the history at all to
No.
read and enjoy this book. It's, if you're going in completely cold, that is fine. You're going to have a wild and very enjoyable ride. So,
Yeah.
don't worry about it. But Also, I think I'm looking forward to re-listening to some of those episodes now that I've read the book so that I can see, I can learn more about the real history and see more of those parallels and, like you say, where you departed. Oh, Jenny, I love this book so much. I'm very excited for the world to get to read it. I was excited to get to read it early. Listeners, if you are into spicy romance and history, I know at least that you're into history. And if you're not into spicy romance, I highly recommend this be, why not give it a try? Let this be your starting point. Run out and buy Enemy of My Dreams. Get it from your library. I'm assuming that there's going to be an audiobook as well, Jenny.
Yes, there is. It's going to be coming out at the same time, February 4th.
Amazing. Oh, I cannot. I love a book I really love. I like to read it first and then listen to the audio. So I really look forward to doing that. And thank you so much for joining us and talking about this incredible book.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been so great.
Thanks for listening. If you like the sound of Enemy of My Dreams, you'll find it now wherever good books or audiobooks are sold. If you dig The Exploress, and I hope you do, tell a friend about it, or leave me a star rating and a review wherever you listen. It really helps like-minded listeners find the show. Thank you to Joshua Stackhouse for my theme music and Mr. Exploress, aka Paul Gablonsky, for my logo. Until next time.